Allô, allô. Quand c'est...
It's about to begin, and so good morning, everybody. We're about to begin the Meet the Author session, so pop your headsets on. Just a reminder, if you can't hear me, it's because you're on the wrong channel, so it means you need to change to channel 1 to hear the original language. Otherwise, there'll be translation on channel 3, and you use that by pressing the little silver button in the middle of your headset, and you turn the dial to increase or decrease the volume. I wish you a good session. Thank
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? It's working. Okay, good. Because with multiple devices, it's a bit complex. Well, thank you all for coming this morning. It's a great pleasure to welcome Rana Dasgupta this morning. My name is Irène Hors. I work at the OECD. I'm in charge of collaboration with India, China, and Brazil. I'm here today to introduce Rana in this Meet the Author session. So it's really an opportunity to interact with Rana about the book that he will be presenting in a few minutes, Capital. But let me first maybe say a few words about him. So Rana is a British-Indian writer. He writes novels and essays that he describes himself as urban folk tales. But I find that he has a very special way of using literature to talk about our world, the forces of globalization, markets, and capitalism that are shaping our world, our lives, and our psyche, and how these create value, but also sometimes destroy value. Rana has a double culture background, his father being from northern India and his mother from Sussex, so it's also a very interesting combination of cultures. So today the work he will be presenting is Capital. I would say it's also probably, I don't know, but he will tell us a reference to Karl Marx's book, A Critic of Political Economy. So it's not by chance that, it's called Capital. So it's talking about Delhi, but it's also talking about capitals of the world and especially emerging big cities in countries like India, China, etc. So I will not say much more, but just to say that it's a very interesting text, encountering the city through different stories, different meetings. So it's really juxtaposition of different worlds, different stories, different forces, different times, And these all come together under Rana's pen and his voice, which is very charming, full of sense of humor, full of sense of history as well. So it's really a book that I strongly recommend. He touches on many, many topics that are really at the heart of OECD work. So it's literature, it's about Delhi, but it's also very much about what the OECD tries to do, looking at the future of work, the future of urbanization, global trade, the impact on the rural areas, on the environment, etc. I've said enough. Rana, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irène. Good morning. Thank you for coming. I'll talk for a short amount of time because the more interesting thing is to find out what you are interested in talking about and for us to have a conversation. Of course, the title of this book, which came out in 2014, and a lot has happened in Indian society and politics since then, so we can talk about that too. The title of this book is, of course, a reference to Marx, and the book is, in many ways, an attempt to write a next chapter to a lot of the work that started in the 19th century, looking at places like London and Paris. The wave of the spread of capitalism, which at that point was transforming cities like London and Paris and Manchester, and later on Chicago and New York, has hit places like Delhi, and it is having transformative effects, which is what I really wanted to describe in this book. Not only effects of money and infrastructure, but also effects of a more intimate kind, effects on family relationships, religious identities, and political psyche. So my book was an attempt to find out about how these things were working in rapidly globalizing India by going and doing interviews with people. I went and spoke to probably about 100 people, ranging from billionaires to drug dealers to slum dwellers to fashion designers and people going through a lot of the phenomena of contemporary India, like divorce or family conflict and all these sorts of things. So a few kind of generalizations about what I found and what I said. It was very interesting that I think the central characters in the book are business people. In a way, I was trying to understand what the new business elite of India, how they thought about India's future, what they wanted, what kind of society they wanted to create, what was their sense of social responsibility, how different were they to elites in America or Britain. And so I spent a lot of time with those people, many of them men who were inheriting family businesses, often extremely wealthy. A couple of them had billion-dollar family businesses. It was very interesting because it was difficult to get access to some of these people, but once I got access to them, they were the ones who kept calling me and saying, "Can we talk again? Can we talk again?" And I realized I was providing a kind of therapy to these people, many of whom didn't have conversations in their normal lives about some of the things that we discussed. It was an extremely macho culture of men who didn't talk about failure, who didn't talk about private things very much, and projected an idea of kind of perpetual success, extreme masculine power, etc. The world that I uncovered in this book is an extremely corrupt world, if that word is even appropriate. A world in which there is a complete marriage of politics and business, and where a political business nexus is essentially developing certain massive projects very fast. So I felt that it was a mistake to contrast authoritarian China with democratic India. In fact, a lot of the massive new projects of India, the new highways, the new airports, are actually completely authoritarian in the way that they are done. There is a kind of political fiat, a business partner. Farmers are kicked off land using state apparatus, police, bureaucracy, etc. And business people come in who are friends of politicians and partners and build these things very fast. So the world that this book describes is a world, though India models itself on the US to a very great extent, the elite send their children to American universities, they speak with American accents, and they cultivate American values. It is the city I describe as much more close to Moscow than to New York or Washington. A city in which a small number of extremely well-networked people have huge control over access to opportunities, capital, etc. There are enormous monopolies of business opportunities in the capital. The capital of India, rapid recap, socialism was the dominant economic orthodoxy for 45 years, or state-controlled capitalism, which produced a situation in which business people, like in Moscow, had to go to the capital from all over the country if they wanted access to the biggest things, because they needed to be close to politics. So in the 60s and 70s, this drift began of business people to Delhi. And the several billion-dollar fortunes that have happened in Delhi since the 1990s of the opening up of the economy are usually in areas which are highly government-controlled. So telecoms, land, real estate, these forestry, large-scale manufacturing, things that require government permits and government connections. These are the major fortunes that come out of Delhi. So it's a city of parties, of connections, of people hanging out in hotel lobbies and just meeting each other a lot and forming connections. In this period, probably during the time that I lived in the city, which was 15 years, about 7 million people moved to the city from the countryside. It was the time of a huge sort of destruction and reformation of Indian agriculture, which left a lot of people either wanting to move to the city for its opportunities or unable anymore to sustain the life that they had in the countryside. Huge ecological devastation and also industrial incursions into the countryside. These people could not largely find work in the cities. Indian manufacturing is nothing like on the scale of Chinese manufacturing. And there are something like 15 million people every year entering the Indian workforce, about 1 million people every month, because of the large number of children in the country. And currently, there's nothing in the economy that can absorb that kind of number of people. Only extremely large-scale manufacturing on Chinese scales can do so. So there is this problem of what you do when an agricultural system that's sustaining about 800 million people starts to come undone in a very short amount of time, and you have to somehow find space and work for those people. India has not solved that problem yet. I think the two things I would say about capitalism as it displays itself in India, one, or my study of it in this book, one is that despite the words we use, globalization, etc., capitalism is extremely different in different places. And a lot of what my book tries to show is how capitalism in Delhi is extremely different even from capitalism in Bombay or Bangalore because of local histories. So, in the old centers of capitalism, in Britain, for instance, the transition from feudalism into mercantile capitalism and into what we have today is extremely gradual. But when these things came into India, it was extremely rapid, and all kinds of existing structures were immediately co-opted into market capitalism. So capitalism in Delhi remains very feudal in many respects. It's the old feudal landlords, etc., who are now running the businesses, owning the real estate, etc. And a lot of things from Delhi's past, especially the partition of India, which killed about 2 million people and was the huge trauma of that part of the world, continues to display itself in the way that capitalism works out. So the fear of Islam, for instance, remains a massive driving force in a lot of these business families. The memory of colonialism. So a lot of business families are explicitly motivated by forms of historical revenge. Buying British companies is not just a kind of wise business move. It is experienced as a form of revenge on the previous one erstwhile colonial ruler. So there's all kinds of warrior energies to the way that capitalism works out in India today, which are would probably be strange to outsiders, to Westerners who might view capitalism as primarily a civilian process. I think it's regarded as a military process by a lot of the business people in North India. And religion is also a huge part of their life. I think, like a lot of socialist countries who have rapidly become extremely capitalist in their ethos, there is enormous guilt about the possession of money, about the sudden consumerist ethos, and it does not go well with a lot of the very frugal, ascetic Hindu ideals of many of the families that have become very wealthy in that time. So exercising your guilt and your money and your impurity is a very big part. So the more money people have, the more gurus and priests and temple visits there are around, the more kind of jewels they wear to ward off evil spirits, the more $10 million homes are never occupied because the priest says you won't have children in this home, or some other bad thing will happen to you, or it faces the wrong direction. So it's a strangely superstitious and paranoid group of people. I think paranoid like other kind of criminal elites who have made money very fast and believe that it can probably be taken away from them very quickly too. These are the very local things. These are the things that it might be difficult from the outside to predict about capitalism in this city. Some of them are very paradoxical or irrational, and they show us that capitalism does not necessarily produce the cultural or psychological effects that we think it does, looking from the West, say. But the book is not just a book about Delhi, it's a book about global capitalism, and to a very great extent, I argue that a lot of the things that are going on in Delhi, which are in many respects very dark and given the enormous inequalities, very cruel, are not in any ways a sign of an immature capitalism. They are actually the sign of mature 21st century capitalism, and indeed, just to a great extent, signs of the global future rather than the global past. There is an old idea in the West that there is sort of some kind of universal timeline in which all countries are arranged from the past to the present. America and Europe are around the present, and everyone else is kind of organized behind. And therefore, when we leave the West, we are looking at the past. I'm arguing in this book that that timeline, if it ever had any kind of reality, is differently organized today. When we leave the West, we see the future of the West. And I think the more, as I was writing the book, the more I engaged with the sort of the corruption, the inequality, the various kinds of paranoid political energies, the religious extremism entering into politics, the more I came to Europe or America, the more the newspapers all looked the same. These things that seemed to be primitive energies in capitalism actually were erupting more and more in the old centers. I think the kinds of the fact that places like India and much of the former Soviet bloc and many other countries in the world experienced global capitalism in its pure form for the first time in the 1980s or the 1990s meant that they skipped les Trente Glorieuses. They never participated in that mode, that period of capitalism. They came in when the erosion of middle-class wealth, the erosion of welfare systems and everything was already well underway, and they never sought to repeat that kind of experiment. So you will never have, I mean, a lot of people who read this book say, well, when is the middle class going to get rich and going to start, you know, the kinds of political and social advances that happened in Europe in the 19th century and in the middle of the 20th century. I think that's not going to happen. The middle class will never be that expansive, and you will continue to have an economic structure pretty similar to what there is today, which is of a rather small, globalized group of people who speak English and who manage essentially the interface between this enormous population and territory and the global economy. And then you'll have pretty much everyone else who struggles really to be included in that situation. But to a greater and greater extent, because I teach in the US, that country is looking far more like what I've just described, with the same kinds of sort of political repercussions that we know. I'll stop there, and we can go for questions, and then maybe we can talk about something else entirely that I haven't thought of.
Thank you, Rana. I think it's a very good overview of the depth of this book. I would be interested to engage more on the discussion of what democracy and India's democracy can bring, especially because Delhi is led by a party which was founded on the issue of the fight against corruption. But maybe we could open the floor to other questions to see what the audience wants to discuss in priority. So please, any questions, any reactions? Alors attends, I don't know how this is organized. Do we have a mic? Yes, there is a mic. If you can just introduce yourself. Pass on the mic.
Is it working? Yeah. Hello, my name is Delia Vizen. I would like to thank to Mrs. Hors for Hors?
Hors.
Hors.
It's okay.
For inviting here Mr. Rana Dasgupta, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation and introducing us to your book. I had the opportunity to travel several times to India and especially to Delhi, working with Delhi School of Economics, and I could feel, live, and see all this inequality, poverty, corruption, political, all this part that you expose in the book. But at the same time, I also had this opportunity to look at the spiritual part of India, and to see also that there is another elite, the spiritual elite, dealing with all that comes now very quickly in the West: meditation, yoga, mindfulness. So my question to you is the following. Why do we call India a developing country? Which criteria we use to put this name on India, since the elite part and spiritual part is now getting more and more in the West? And yes, another question: how do you see the future of India and also of capitalism in India by 2050? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll take a second one.
Right.
I'm going to take it at the same time. Shamabil, I'm an economist from New Zealand. I really enjoyed reading your book, and one thing that really resonated with me was when you talked about how the means becomes the prize, when you're talking about money and the corruption that goes with it. What's your perspective in terms of how does that means becomes the prize differ in what has happened in India versus what's happened in the West?
Can you explain the phrase again?
So when you're talking about money and the search for money, that has become the prize, and rather than the means to an end of a better society, more fairness, more equity, all those things that you talk about in the book. But it seems to me that we've become very focused on just the accumulation of wealth and money. and we've forgotten some of the other stuff, which economic growth and capitalism is kind of meant to provide.
Thank you. I mean, I think to some extent there are relationships between your first question and this question, which is issues of values. I think, can you hear me? I can't hear myself. I think that one of the things we can project. You say we've forgotten about the other stuff, but I think that we project onto societies whose relationship to this kind of capitalism is quite recent, a set of values that we think capitalism has, but they don't. A lot of those values are actually introduced into a market system from other things, from religious systems, for instance. In Europe and America, there's been a very powerful set of religious constraints on what incursions capitalism can make into spiritual life, family life, and all these kinds of things. I think in Asia, particularly where family businesses are the norm and where it's assumed that the entire family life will be organized around the furtherance of the family business, those kind of limits often don't exist. And I think that the great sense, and I think this also has to do with all these things you're talking about, religious and other kinds of traditional experiences and values, I think the sense that so many other forms of value, as I say in the book, are being replaced by this one value of money, has to do with the fact that, as I say, when you are told for 2 generations that capitalism is the source of all evil, and suddenly, overnight, that's what you're living, do you suddenly reverse your idea of capitalism and think, actually, capitalism is a great moral system? No. You enter into it with the same idea of what it is, that it is total corruption, total moral corruption, but now I have to live it. And therefore, I will just become the kind of savage, acquisitive individual that I was always told capitalist individuals were. I will become that, and I will understand that capitalism. I'm not going to be surprised that capitalism breeds inequality, oppression, cruelty, suffering, etc. Because I was always told that's what capitalism meant. The only response I can have is to come out on top. And so I think money is not just money is the interest in money is a very primal kind of thing in a situation like that. And I don't think that the other kinds of values that we ascribe to capitalism are there at all. Philanthropy, for instance, is extremely minimal. The multi-billion-dollar elite of India has not generally, especially in the north, has not generally given much away to people in the country, though they have made huge endowments to Harvard and to Brown and places like this. I think this particular elite is extremely globalized, and like the rest of this class today, doesn't have powerful relationships to the place it's in. So if you look at the New York elite of the early 20th century, they were in New York, and that's where they gave their money. They built these theaters, they built these libraries. Their wealth was very magnificent in the city. The Delhi elite doesn't do anything in Delhi. They send their kids to American universities. They have real estate in London. They have their money offshore. And if they want to give it away, they give it away to people who really know how to make them look good, which is American universities. I think a whole set of values that were assumed to be internal to capitalism are not internal to capitalism at all. When you see capitalism in its raw form, it's actually a pretty shocking thing. the future. This is a very ancient country which has enormous civilizational resources, and I don't think you can always predict exactly how those will continue to manifest themselves. It is a place of not only over 1 billion people, but more than 20 official languages, many religions, and what cultural and intellectual resources will be deployed to deal with some of these problems, by definition, one can't anticipate. I think the near future is very rough, because there is an enormous population to accommodate, excuse me, in a system that is increasingly stern and where opportunities for the majority are quite limited. But this is also a democracy. It is a complicated democracy which has been co-opted to a very great extent by economic elites, but it is a very functioning democracy in which people vote in enormous numbers, and where, as has been shown time and again, you cannot deceive people for too long. So it is possible that major social experiments will happen in India, and that it will find ways of, India has been one of the most innovative places in terms of taking Western corporate models and adapting them for countries where a lot of people are extremely poor, extremely information poor, etc. Maybe it can also be very innovative in political systems and cultural systems as well. But right now, I suspect that what is actually happening is going to be more prevalent, and that is a kind of a rallying of political community through religious and tribal identities, which will continue to have violent consequences in the short term. But the current Prime Minister of India has used those kinds of techniques extremely effectively to generate a sort of sense of community and dynamism about the nation state.
Attends, we need the microphone.
Il y a une question là-bas aussi.
Ouais.
My name is
Yes.
My name is Luigi Troiani. I run the Foundation Pietro Nenni in Rome, and I teach international relations in the university. I have 3 questions. Because your book is related to deals with a town, there are global movements of towns against states. There are many. I would like to know your perception of the phenomenon, if it is just a kind of mood or it can be effective in a way. Second, because New Delhi is also inside that. The second question is, China and India have been analyzed by many scholars as a kind of antithetic models for Asia. For the reasons we know and I don't need to recall. Listening to your words, apparently this contradiction is diminished, let's say like this. Once again, I would like your opinion. Is still India kind of antithetic models for developing Asia or not? The third question is, it relates with your analysis of religious phenomena or religious extremism in India. I traveled sometimes through India, and I was not impressed by India's spirituality as my colleague here, because the extreme poverty and deaths in the streets and so on and so forth felt me feel to be inside a kind, with all respect, cruel society. And this is not a lot to do with true spiritualism or religion, I guess. So my question is, Gandhi was killed by an extremist, a religious extremist. With the Hinduist party in government, something changed, or something increased as far as the hate or problems among religious communities in India are concerned. What is your perception as far as religious relations among communities in India?
Thank you. I mean, I think this question of cruelty is a very complicated question. It is assumed we're very convenient in the way that we talk about things like globalization. So I think at this point, the global poor are also globalized. They are also a global possession. They do not belong only to local elites. So to say that, let's say, the Indian middle classes are cruel because they live in great proximity to 800 million poor people, whereas the Western middle classes are absolved of that same cruelty because they're geographically divided. To me, there's no case for this. In fact, I would say that in many respects, the fact that the Indian middle classes live in that sort of proximity means that they have limits to their cruelty. Actually, they are forced to accommodate the modes of the global poor into their lives in ways that the Western middle classes would never accept. I mean, the idea that the wealthy Western neighborhoods would accept 300 people coming and setting tents up outside their house and living like that and cooking on the street, there's no way, but actually that is a daily experience for the Indian middle classes. So I'm suspicious of this point. I feel that the West has organized the world spatially in order not to see global poverty. It has reorganized all the systems of finance and labor such that global poverty is not part of its sensuous experience. And who is then cruel? I think that when you go to India, you see a very cruel situation, but I don't think it's India's situation. And I don't think it reflects only on the Indian psyche. I think it reflects on the global system that produces these kinds of inequalities. In India, they're all in one place. Elsewhere, it's not the same. I think this question of cities is very interesting. The relationship between Delhi and the nation state is, of course, very different from other cities in India. Delhi was the British moved the imperial capital to Delhi, self-consciously taking up the previous whatever it would be 5 centuries in which Delhi was again the imperial capital under the Mughal Empire. And the independent state of India essentially moved straight into the British infrastructure. They used the British Parliament, they used the British governor's residence, they used the British bungalows and everything. And in many ways, the relationship of Delhi to the nation state, to the nation, continues to be imperial, I think. The business and political elite in Delhi see their role as one of conquerors and speak about the rest of the country with enormous kind of imperial entitlement. So I don't think that Delhi, though there have of course been very interesting social movements in the city, protests against corruption, protests against violence against women, that's another subject we haven't touched on, but gender is a spectacularly important issue in that city. Violence against women is on a scale that is it's at a kind of where you would talk about it in military kind of terms in terms of the casualties. So there have been huge social movements in the city to try and reclaim the city, but the group of people who feels politically entitled in that kind of way is rather small, and in a sense the political class is extremely secure from those kind of things. So I think that Delhi is not anytime soon going to set itself against the nation state. At the same time, it's quite interesting that a lot of people who voted for the party that runs the city, which is a party that's against corruption, that's in favor of egalitarian reforms in the political system, also voted for Prime Minister Modi, who is pretty much the direct reverse of those things. Because I feel that Indian voters in general are cynical of any political movement and cynical of anything that gets too much power, and will play things off against each other and ensure that there are limits to any kind of a power center.
We have just a few more minutes.
Just one thing about China and India.
Just to tell you where the time.
Yeah, I think, of course, they're very different, and of course we could spend days discussing the differences between them, but I think you could also just say that India is the same but less competent. In a lot of the things that China is doing, India is also doing, and I just wanted to mention that a lot of the billionaires I spoke to were themselves buying up huge resources in Africa. They don't have the same state backing as China does. They're doing it in a private capacity. They can't do it on the scale that China does. But I think that it's important to understand that the corrupt elite of India has a very bright future because they have developed skills which are globally very useful right now. The African continent is extremely receptive to those skills. How do you go and speak to a president and talk about getting 20,000 people off this land so that you can buy it and repurpose it for food plantations or real estate or tourist resorts? Indian businessmen have been developing those skills for a long time. They know how to pay bribes, they know how to work both sides of a political system, and they are not in competition there with American corporations who can't do any of those kinds of things. So I think that this, the idea that this corruption will die out of its own accord because states will take control and there'll be a kind of reform of all these things. I'm not sure that's the case, because I think this corruption is very useful for a long time to come in taking advantage of the economic opportunities in the world today.
Time is almost up. I'd like to give the opportunity for a little bit more discussion because it's really very interesting. Please.
Thank you very much. Hi, Rana.
Sorry, 1 minute.
I'm Rahul Malhotra. I work at the OECD in development, and I'm British Indian as well. It's interesting what you say about globalized elites, because my own observation and reflection... Can you hear me?
Now I can. Yeah.
My own sort of observations and reflections of Delhi and India are that my parents' generation and the generations above them were very sort of insular, very inward-looking, very protectionist of India and its values. But I see that changing in terms of my generation and my cousins and their kids in having much more of an open sort of worldview and traveling a lot more and living abroad and coming back. So I wonder whether you see any sort of intergenerational shift in Delhi and India that may sort of ultimately affect the social and political fabric and may actually give us a bit of hope for the future in terms of driving accountability without corrupting Indian values, retaining the best of Indian values, but actually driving some accountability in the political class and elites.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's huge changes going on within the middle classes. It's too huge for us. How much time do we have? No time, right? I mean, you can even see people who are currently in their 30s and 40s educating their parents who are in their 60s and 70s and 80s about how to just deal with the kind of furniture of consumerist life. Seeing people who've never eaten out in their entire lives, not because they don't have the money, but because it goes against their frugality, it goes against their sense of hygiene, or it breaks all kinds of taboos that they've grown up with, suddenly being taught to eat sushi by their children and being taken out to restaurants on a daily basis because that's the new culture and they have to kind of get used to it. And of course that their kids, they travel abroad, they study abroad, and all sorts of things. It's complicated what changes. Some of these kids come back and slot very easily into the life that they had before. It's family business better, but their relationship to their servants, their workers, is rather unchanged. But there are, of course, many people who have the experience of going to a liberal arts college in the US who come back and want to make real changes. And some of them also make a lot of money and have the ability to do big things. So, for instance, one of the guys I interview in the book, a guy called Ashish Dhawan, who made a fortune at Goldman Sachs in New York, has come back and started an extraordinary set of institutions, liberal arts colleges in India, which are low-priced on a global scale, have amazing professors, and are providing a large-scale liberal arts education to middle-class Indian people. These are things that are incredibly crucial because the elite basically has relied on the idea that there is a set of universities already built in America which their kids will go to, so why bother building universities that they will never attend in India? But people are also changing these kinds of things, and there is also a culture of reform and all these sorts of things. But it is a massive job. The scale is enormous, and it will take a generation for us to see a lot of the fruits of those things.
I have the organizers in the back really pressing me to end up. So maybe we can continue the conversation on the sides if Rana agrees. Sorry. And I think there is also a book signature stand over there.
Right.
For those who are interested. I'm really sorry, but I had the organizer kind of
I'm
looking.
an organizer.
Okay, well then ask your questions and you deal with the people in the back.
Just a very brief, Rana, thanks very much. Rory Clark from the OECD. Quite a cruel account that you're giving. I'm wondering where the bright rays of hope are in your mind, the optimism. It feels a little bit cruel, your account. But in particular, I'd like you to maybe just very briefly develop what you mean, because I found that very interesting, that point you made earlier on about when you leave the West, you see the future of the West. This idea that is the future of capitalism for us all. Maybe just develop that thinking in a few more lines.
Well, I believe that we have that ideas matter, and that we don't have to accept some sort of fate. We can actually design our future. So I offer Delhi, in the form it is, as a kind of cautionary tale of what happens when you allow enormous inequalities, enormous sort of concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few, and you gradually allow all your public systems to collapse. But that's not the only kind of future we can imagine. But we do need, I think, forms of capitalism we need to invent new forms of capitalism that can actually provide hope to people, to the 800 million, and not just to the small middle class minority. And maybe those things that don't look like what we think capitalism looks like. I think the hope is in the extraordinary political consciousness of these places. As I say, this is a democracy. It's a place where people believe in the political infrastructure. They believe in institutions, and they vote people out when they realize that nothing is being done. And increasingly, as people become very information rich, because one of the things that mobile telephony has done is to make even the poorest people very information rich, is that ideas about social transformation travel very fast. So I think that the hope is not in politicians doing the right thing. The hope is in dramatic new social movements, which we're beginning to see on every issue under the sun.
Well, with that, I wanted to thank you very much for all coming to meet with Rana, and thank you so much, Rana, for your presentation. But I really encourage you to read the book. It's absolutely marvelous. It's a philosophical object. So thanks to all.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, yes, yes.
We are very active at the video level with European Federation of Progressive Studies